Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Welcome back to American Medieval. I am Professor Matthew Gabriele, and we are joined today by Professor Megan L. Cook, who is the Arthur Jeremiah Roberts Associate Professor and co-chair of the Department of English at Colby College. Thanks for joining us, Megan.
Hello.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. You have many titles there, and I want to talk about kind of what those titles kind of mean, because I think a lot of our audience doesn't know kind of what a named professorship is, or even what a chair of a department kind of does. So, and then being a medievalist on top of that, so wearing many hats, as we all do. But the thing I want to start with, if it's okay, is kind of maybe a silly question, but it's something I think that any of us who study the past generally kind of have to deal with at some point, because it's about time machines.
Of course. I should have seen this coming, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's all over my face, which, of course, none of the podcast listeners can see, but, So, time machines. Everybody has a complicated relationship with time machines who studies the past, right? But imagine for a moment we have that time machine. The time machine is here. It is presented to Megan Cook here in 2025 with the provision that you get to go back and talk to childhood Megan Cook and tell her that she becomes a medievalist in the future. What does young Megan Cook say to that revelation?
Well, I think she's disappointed that our career on Broadway did not work out.
Fair enough.
Childhood dreams of being a triple threat and so on did not come to fruition. But when I have talked with people who knew me in childhood or reconnected, with folks I went to elementary school with or things like that, what are you up to these days? Oh, I'm an English professor. I teach medieval literature. The response is usually something along the lines of, oh, that tracks, right?
Something about telegraph that career path, huh?
Yeah,
okay.
I was a big nerd. I have a aunt who does or did at the time historical seamstress. She made costumes, right?
Okay, yeah.
And she made me a beautiful long cape.
Oh, fantastic.
That was a prized possession for a few years there. I did wear it to school. I did wear it out in public. So I think that's a lot where the oh yeah, we saw this written.
Yeah.
So I think probably childhood Megan, she would hope that we have cooler capes and, garb in the fair sense. Yeah, I think that would be the first question would be, what are the outfits like?
What are the outfits like? Okay, so importance of aesthetics. Again, kind of consistent with your work, which we'll talk about, maybe in a little bit. But again, the disappointment of the Broadway dream.
Whomst among us?
I mean, yeah, exactly. I thought, as I've, mentioned in other episodes here, that, I thought I'd be playing first base for the New York Yankees. That did not work out.
Yeah.
I had backup plans to play as an international soccer player. Again, did not work out.
Sure.
But here we are. It is interesting, though, when I've asked this, people have different kind of ages that they're thinking of when I say kind of childhood versions of themselves. But the one consistent thing is that, there's something there in the past that kind of connects to what we're interested in now. So, for you, like you were saying, about kind of costumes and things like that, there was something about that when you were talking about with your friends, they could see that kind of through line. For other people, it's books, read a lot of Tolkien or other sort of fantasy when they were, kids. Or I think the through line for me was I played with Legos a lot, and so it was mostly the medieval sets I was mostly interested in.
Yes. Which
were super interested. But it's weird how those kind of childhood things kind of carry forward and then become not necessarily subjects of our own study, but certainly part of our identity as medievalists, right?
Absolutely. And my other identity besides medievalist is book historian, right? So a lot of my research deals with the way texts from the Middle Ages get copied and recopied and transformed through that process of transmission and reception. And so my mother is an artist, and my father, before he retired, was an accounting professor. So
Okay.
the history of the book lies squarely at the intersection of graphic arts and these kind of like microeconomic considerations. Once you get into early printing, it's all people suing one another about shoddy small business practices and bad investments. So that's the other way in which I think it was written, at least if not in the stars. I can remember being taken as a small child with my mom to drop off materials that were going to be printed. And this was the mid 80s. So she was going into print shops that still had the letterpress and the linotype machines. So a lot of the things that fascinate me about the Middle Ages were also things that fascinated me as a kid, not necessarily in the Lego sense, although I had the Legos too.
Sure.
But they were part of kind of the world I lived in. And I think that's another through line to the work that I do today is the way, and I know this is a going concern for you as well, the medieval is never really medieval, right? That most of what's interesting about it is also part of what's interesting about the here and now.
Yeah, there's an unruliness, right, about the Middle Ages. It doesn't seem to want to stay in the Middle Ages itself.
Indeed.
Wow. I mean, I think the way that you described it, like short of naming your child Jeeves and then becoming a butler, right? Like, I mean, you seem kind of really conditioned for this career that you have.
Yeah, it was not a huge shock to anyone, I don't think.
No. Everyone's, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. Surprise. So, you kind of described kind of shoddy business practices in book history, but I think maybe for our readers, what can you just kind of give us like a quick and dirty rundown is like, what does book history kind of mean? Like, is it just a physical object or is it something kind of more than that?
Right. So there are probably as many definitions of book history as there are people out there identifying as book historians. And it's gone by various names over the years. Critical bibliography is a term that gets used sometimes as well. So it's the study of the material text, which might be a book. It also could be a digital file. It could be a scroll. It could be, something etched in stone, depending on when and where we're talking about. But if there's anything that unites the field, it is an interest in how the material conditions of communication shape the facts of communication, the meaning that we make of the text that we have, but also the economics, the cultural politics of textual transmission as comes down to us in these physical objects, whether they're manuscripts, early printed books, can really be a lot of things.
Yeah. It's probably something that even, I'm not a book historian at all. I mean, I certainly work on manuscripts. I think about manuscript production in kind of the early and central Middle Ages in some ways. But like even today, like I don't think a lot about how a book gets to me in some ways and all the various processes. And this was true in the past as well, right? Like there were lots of things that were involved, from manuscript production, hand lettering and things like that, all the way to, the new printing press and things of that nature. I remember when my first book with David Perry, The Bright Ages, came out a few years ago, there was a paper shortage. There was a global paper shortage because the pandemic was going on. And so that was not something I had never thought kind of would impact things. And then I remember our publisher saying something too about, because everything's printed in South Asia nowadays, or most things are printed in South Asia nowadays. And they were telling us this doesn't happen to our book, but a container ship was heading across the ocean and it hit a storm and one container fell off. And that was the entire print run of another author's book. And so like, that was it. They had to wait like 6 months to republish the whole thing. It couldn't exist. You just don't think about these things, right?
That's terrible for the author, but a really great example of the ways in which, the life of books is part of the whole world around us, right? And nothing is getting beamed magically into your head, right? People had to cut down the trees to make the paper, process the paper. I live here in Maine where there's a long history of logging for paper production. That's still occurring. I can look out the window and I can't see specifically, but I teach in Waterville, Maine, where there's a very large paper plant that's been dormant since the 90s, but it's a mile long, right? I don't think, even I as a book historian who works on the 15th, 16th century, really wrap my head around how much these things I think of in a historical context are still very much with it today. But I was sort of nodding when you said that your book was delayed because of a paper shortage, because the same thing happened when my first monograph came out in 2019, The Poet and the Antiquaries, which came out with Penn. And my editor said, look, I have bad news, but you're going to love it.
That's a great thing to say. Yeah.
He's not going to cut. This was Jerry Singerman, who was there for years and years. And he said, well, okay, but your book is delayed, but it's for a very, book historical reason. There's a paper shortage. Yes. Proof of method, right?
Proof of method, that's right. Like this is the necessity of book history right here, is to understand these things. So you talked about kind of book history specifically in the 15th and 16th century. So how would a book be made in that particular period?
All right. Well, that's an interesting period to talk about, right? Because we have two processes happening simultaneously
indeed.
Western Europe. Now, if we zoom out, if we're talking about other parts of the world, East Asia, for example, printing there starts much earlier. You've got the Diamond Sutra, the date of which I am not going to attempt to cite correctly off the top of my head, but maybe you can put it in show notes or something. So, but in the 15th century, 16th century in Europe, your everyday stuff is likely still being produced by hand. As a lot of people know, monasteries were a major center for manuscript production, where you would have folks working on parchment, right, which is a writing surface made from animal skin, but also increasingly paper. Now we think of it as wood pulp, but in the period, mostly made from recycled rags, linen. So a real full circle moment. People could be wearing the clothes that would one day, make the paper that they would write their will bequeathing other clothes on.
Fantastic. Love it.
And so you increasingly get in England, which is the area I focus on, London becomes a center for bureaucratic textual production. And we have figures that we know about like Thomas Hockleave, who we know because he was a poet, but he was also a scribe. He was a great admirer of Geoffrey Chaucer, but his day-to-day job was copying over these documents, most of which are on paper. So the process of manuscript production, you get your surface, whether it's paper or a stack of parchment. You write on it using ink that you've likely made yourself. We have a lot of recipes that come down in kind of household books, things that have recipes for medicines, for food, but also for things like ink. You're going to write with a pen, which might be your sort of stereotypical quill pen, although probably not, with the super fluffy ostrich plume, or possibly a metal stylus. And you copy it all out by hand. And depending on what you're copying, this could be really well planned, ruled out ahead of time, or it could look, like somebody's class notebook with kind of a scrawl, legible only to its author. But then in the middle of the 15th century, we start to talk about movable type. And when we think about someone like Gutenberg, who is associated with the printing press, this is what we're thinking about. And the printing press, it's a modified wine press that has a screw that puts a flat piece called a platen down on top of a series of letters that are assembled to make the text that you are printing. So those are laid out on the bed of the press in reverse. Ink is put on top of the letters, the pieces of type. The paper or whatever else you're printing on is put on top of that. Then you use the screw or lever to press down on the whole sandwich with force. You undo it, you pull it off, and you've got a mirror image, which is your correct image of whatever it is you're trying to print. Now, there's a lot of questions about where Gutenberg got this technology. Movable type of a sort had been in use in East Asia for centuries at this point. So how are these ideas traveling? There's a lot of questions worth asking that we don't sort of understand in full yet. But one thing that we do know is even earlier in the 15th century, in Europe, people are making wood blocks that they are using to print books, often heavily illustrated. But for people who can't afford these, monastic, beautiful, handwritten books, and I bring this up in part because it's one of my favorite book historical words, which is xylography, right? The XYL is the same as in xylophone. But it also, I think, is worth bringing up because it is a good reminder of how few sharp transitions there are. People think about the 15th century, the 16th century. You talk about the print revolution. You talk about the Protestant Reformation. You can talk about a lot of other important economic and political changes that are happening in Western Europe at this time. But when you zoom in a little bit more, there's often things that presage in the way that, for example, xylographic books presage movable type. So there again, right, the medieval as we think of it today, I love telling my students, print is a medieval technology, right?
Yeah.
It happens in the 15th century.
It does indeed.
And yeah, so that's a nutshell description of printing. And I apologize in advance to all of my hardcore incunabula scholar colleagues who may be listening to this. I'm sure I missed some important bits.
Oh, yeah, they can just email me and I'll forward everything onto you, all the hate mail.
Thank you.
Don't worry, not a
Appreciate
problem.
it.
Yeah. I think one of the things there's a lot that I really want to kind of talk a little bit more about with this point of transition, right? But I think that's such an important point that we often struggle to convey to, especially to wider audiences or like introductory students that we're talking to, is that there aren't these sharp breaks, right? Like you were saying, right? Like there are people still hand copying things, and then there's people who are printing on wood blocks for a long time, and then we have the introduction of or quote unquote introduction of the movable press and stuff like that. So I guess one question that kind of springs to mind related to that is like, was there competition between kind of hand lettering monks who are still or entrepreneurs who are still kind of copying books by hand when these new technologies were invented, or was it more they thought they were kind of for separate things?
That's a really good question. And there's a lot of different ways that it might be answered. I think the short answer is it depends. So something else that often gets overlooked when we start to think about the transition from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance or early modernity, however we want to define it, is that it happens in different times and different places. We can talk about somebody like Petrarch in Italy as an early humanist, but he was dead before you get Geoffrey Chaucer in England, who we think of as our sort of medieval poet par excellence. So, I don't want to generalize because also these microeconomic questions can play out in very different ways.
Sure.
That said, your question makes me think of an absolutely fascinating texts by the monk and polymath Johannes Trithemius, who wrote many, many things, including a work on cryptography. But the one I'm thinking of is called In Praise of Scribes. And so Johannes is writing in this about the value of hand copying as a kind of spiritual labor and the value of an engagement with the text at that kind of embodied level as being something, a way of kind of internalizing a text that can never be duplicated by print. So here's someone who it seems like is really kind of skeptical about certainly the spiritual affordances of this new technology. He has the work printed. So,
people are so weird sometimes.
People are so weird, but also, it's a little bit, like some of the conversations I feel like I am having the conversations with colleagues about AI, right? And I don't want to get too far into that. No. This sense of, technology is still kind of working out what they're best at. Right. So if we think about the earliest printed things, we think about the Gutenberg Bible, but to make the money he needed to actually print the Bible, he's printing forms, he's printing indulgences, right? There's a whole world of job printing that we tend not to think about a lot. And I bet no monk or scribe wanted to make 1,500 copies of the same indulgence against the Turks. Like that seems not very spiritually edifying. But, you can go well into the 16th, 17th century, and you still see beautiful prayer books being made by hand, people compiling manuscripts for personal use. So, we can think about somebody like, I'm thinking of like the shorter works of Geoffrey Chaucer that circulate in manuscript, get printed as a part of Chaucer's collected works beginning in the 1530s, but then pop up in like personal manuscript poetry collections all the way through that. So it's not like a one or the other. It is a lot about people kind of figuring out what works best for their particular needs and affordances.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure with Trithemius, right? Like, if he wanted people to read it, like, and he wanted a lot of copies out there, like, that's the reality of the economics and the society that he's dealing with too, right?
He also just loved new technology. He was like a big nerd in that way.
So he was a big nerd. And the thing about too is that we don't often think about, medievalists kind of often think about when we think about book production is writing is a spiritual practice, right? Like, and that is part of a monastic vocation all the way back into, the rule of Benedict and before, into the 6th and 7th century, is that it wasn't just like a technology of use. I mean, it was that as well, but it was also literally part of what being a monk was. And so giving that up just in the monastic context probably was actually like a really big deal, right? As you said, like nobody wants to sit down and copy 1700 versions of the Indulgence, but at the same time, like that was part of what you did over the course of the year was you wrote things, you copied things.
Absolutely. Yeah. But also some of the earliest printing presses we know about were in monastic settings. So,
sure.
Yeah, you got early adopters all over the place.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. It does make me think, too, like, I don't know if you're a gamer at all. Like, do you know the game Pentiment?
I have not played it.
Okay.
But I have had a lot of people tell me I should.
Yes. I mean, it would be incredibly up your alley. It's a really wonderful, this is not a paid promotion, I should say. So this is just a game that I like. It's a really wonderful, incredibly well illustrated game in which you're an early 16th century German scribe in a monastery. You're not a monk yourself, but you're there and there's all these things kind of going on. The printing press is kind of hovering in the background of this as this young artist is trying to create kind of his masterwork and become a well-known scribe back in Nuremberg. And then the Peasants' War kind of gets involved and it's really super interesting. And then there's a murder mystery too. But I was more interested in, the writing technologies, of course. So anyway, that's the cool thing.
Very Umberto Eco, very Name of the Rose.
It is explicitly, Josh Sawyer, who I believe is the creator of the game, is very explicit that he was heavily inspired by Eco's Name of the Rose. So really wonderful. Run out and pick it up. But again, like I don't get any commission on that.
Yeah.
So anyway, the one thing that's kind of nagging at my head, if I can kind of press you on this, is that though when we're talking about kind of all these books being in circulation, especially like more books being produced, is that I have been reliably informed by the internet that nobody read in the Middle Ages. So is that not true?
Nobody.
Yeah, nobody. Like literacy just like stopped after Rome and then kind of restarted later on.
Yes. Well, it depends what you mean by read.
Okay.
So certainly, right, there are people who, your monks, your people who needed to read and write for professional purposes. But also, there's a whole range of ways of thinking about literacy and ways of thinking about engaging with a text that I think we need to take into account. So the example that comes to mind is Marjorie Kemp. Marjorie Kemp was a woman who lived in East Anglia in the latter part of the 14th, early part of the 15th century. She was married, she was sort of middle class, had 14 children, although we don't know how many lived to adulthood. And when she was a young woman, she had a very frightening, life-threatening experience, perhaps something akin to what we might today label postpartum psychosis, and then a profound experience of spiritual healing and calling. And she spent the rest of her life pursuing that spiritual vocation in various ways, traveling, speaking with various clergymen, going on pilgrimage, disrupting her local church services with her crying and roaring. But the important thing, well, two important things. We know all this because she is the author of the first autobiography in English, known as the Book of Marjorie Kemp.
Phenomenal text.
It's something. Yeah, no, it's well worth a look into if that summary I just gave you is of any interest at all. But she also was herself apparently largely unable to read or write. So the book is full of allusions to and concepts borrowed from popular spiritual texts of the day. And she talks about having her confessor, so a clergyman to whom she would not only confess, but who acted as a kind of more of an everyday spiritual advisor, read to her. It's clear that she's absorbing huge amounts of textual material without necessarily being able to read it herself. And when near the end of her life, she feels called to recount the story of her extraordinary life, she needs to find someone she can dictate it to. And there's a number of different issues that come up with that. It takes, I think, 3 scribes to finally get the whole story down. So this is someone who was able to engage in textual culture by almost any metric, right?
Absolutely.
She's able to understand, grasp, synthesize huge amounts of written material. She's able to kind of tell her own story in her own words. There is one moment where she's having a vision and she's seeing the book of life. And I can't remember if it's Jesus or another, higher level spiritual figure who is showing it to her. But she asks to have her name pointed out to her in that book, right? So the idea is that, she really wouldn't have even been able to recognize her name. So certainly people were reading. This is how you get the literature that I study, right? Almost said guys, there are some women, but largely men. They had an audience, and a lot of that audience probably heard poetry and other kinds of materials read out loud, but were also able to read some or all of it on their own. So again, it depends on time and place, but I think the important thing is that when we start to think about literacy, reading, producing text in the Middle Ages, we have to account for a culture in which orality was just much more important than it is to us today.
Yeah, and I like the way that you mentioned kind of engagement with the text, because it can take a lot of different forms. And I think that this seems to be one of those moments where our modern conceptions of what literacy means really gets in the way of understanding how people engaged with kind of intellectual culture generally, right?
I might actually push back on that a little bit. So I'm teaching a first-year seminar right now called How to Read a Book. And one of the highlights of that for me is I get to talk to a room full of college first years, 16 college first years, twice a week, about what they think about reading. And a theme that's become really prominent in the last couple of years is how much they consume via audiobooks, how much they enjoy consuming books via audiobooks, and that they absolutely consider that a form of reading. So I think we're at an interesting moment where perhaps the very narrow idea of what a book is, how a text is encountered, is also open to flux in a way that makes it easier to think historically about the multiplicity of forms that reading and kind of comprehending a text have taken.
Yeah, that's a totally fair point, a really interesting one. And I'm probably just dating myself by like how I was educated, in which literacy meant like a certain engagement with a physical book, a physical object. There were no Kindles or ebooks or anything like that, let alone audiobooks. I guess there were books on tape back in the day.
Yeah.
But there was a very small subset of all books that were produced or consumed or anything like that. And so things are a little bit different now. So, and that's a really interesting point. But we still use the same kind of language too, don't we, when we talk about kind of audiobooks, is that I read that book.
Yeah.
Right. It's not I listened to that book or anything like that. It's still kind of I read that book. And so we're still thinking of it kind of in the same terms. Maybe.
Yeah. No. And also, from a pedagogical professorial point of view, I do insist that they come to class with a hard copy of the book, even if they've listened to it, right? Because the book as a technology has this wonderful ease of being able to move from passage to passage.
Yes.
And non-linearity that is, very important for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, if you're trying to move very quickly between things, like sometimes ebooks can do that and sometimes they really don't do that particularly well.
Right.
And audiobooks are even a little bit more problematic in those particular ways.
Right. But that comparative capability of the physical book is important.
And that's a nice transition because I want to talk about too is that one of the things too that we kind of talked about at the very beginning, at the very outset, was about kind of how the Middle Ages seems to they don't stay put. We're interested in kind of how the medieval kind of intrudes into the modern world.
Yeah.
So this seems to be not just kind of a moment where we as teachers can talk to our students about like, listen, we're doing this, you're doing this in this different way than has done before. Like, it's not that at all that dissimilar in this particular way to what's going on. There's always a way of kind of making the medieval familiar or making it kind of really kind of different than as a way of kind of teaching. Let's take a break from American Medieval to talk about science. Tiny Matters is an award-winning podcast about tiny things, from molecules to microbes, that have a big and often surprising impact on society. From deadly diseases to forensic toxicology to the search for extraterrestrial life, hosts and former scientists Sam Jones and Debaki Chakravarti embrace the awe and messiness of science and its place in history and today, and how it could impact our world's future. The pod is brought to you by the American Chemical Society, a nonprofit scientific organization based in Washington, D.C., and is also, of course, a part of Multitude. Look for new episodes every Wednesday. Now, back to American Medieval. And one of the things that I'm absolutely fascinated by, and you and I have kind of talked about this before, but is about your work in medievalism, especially dirtbag medievalism, which is just such an evocative, amazing phrase. So could you just give us the 2-second version of what is dirtbag medievalism? How is that different than kind of medievalism generally?
Right. Okay. So medievalism itself is a term that can be used to refer to any imaginative post-medieval engagement with the Middle Ages. So we're not talking here about historical scholarship. We're firmly in Lord of the Rings, the Ren Fair, medieval times, right?
Sure, absolutely.
So that's medievalism. But by dirtbag medievalism, I'm interested in a kind of medievalism that I don't think gets talked about in the same way that your like Arthurian legends do. And by dirtbag medievalism, I'm interested in medievalism as a vibe, medievalism as an aesthetic, medievalism as a means to an end, rather than as a source of connection to some authentic version of the past. It is about this set of signifiers. So you were talking about like the castle Legos, right? You can, put a crenellated thing and a, minifigure with a helmet on it, and you're in the Middle Ages, right?
Yep.
So when I talk about dirtbag medievalism, I'm interested in all of the different things that we do with the medieval in popular culture, consumer culture, that don't really care about authenticity, that are much more about the kind of emotional and affective associations with the medieval than with any sort of historical sense of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is, I was thinking about the crenellations as you were saying that first and foremost, because I teach at Virginia Tech and like the main administrative building.
You got crenellations there.
We got crenellations, right? Like, but it's not evocative of the Middle Ages at all. It's not intended to be, I don't think, particularly. Like it's intended to evoke a particular type of campus architecture that Virginia Tech, when it was created, kind of was aping, which eventually kind of gets you to the Middle Ages and like Oxford and stuff like that. But it's different. But back to kind of the aesthetics and kind of the effective. First of all, one of the great things about dirtbag medievalism is, I don't know if this is particularly intended, but I love a Wheatus reference first and foremost.
Yeah,
So everybody loves a Wheatus reference. But
I saw them in concert last month.
Did you really? Hey, they're still touring. That's amazing.
Yes.
Okay.
But I did not get a chance to sort of share with them how important, as an elder millennial, the song Teenage Dirtbag has been to me both personally and intellectually. But that's a big inspiration. Yeah.
Absolutely. 100%. So us of a certain age, like we got it immediately. It's so great. But there's a kind of like, as you were saying, like a grunginess to the way that that medievalism is, and that's a term that I've seen you use before, to the way that the medieval is kind of evoked but not evoked, right? And so how do we know that it's kind of medieval when the medieval isn't being invoked in that way?
Right. I mean, I think I could point you back to the Lego set.
My Legos are getting a lot of play in this episode.
I love that. But that we have sort of broadly, culturally settled on a set of things that we think of as being medieval, whether or not they actually refer back. And the best example I have of how much consensus there is about what constitutes quote unquote medieval is the Excalibur Casino in Las Vegas. So I went to Las Vegas for the first time about a year ago, and it was a very exciting moment for me. Lots of things going on. I love a themed experience. Las Vegas is full of themed experiences.
Absolutely, yeah.
Also, walking around, you become aware of how difficult it must be to find a theme that really works for a casino that you're going to advertise on a global scale, right? So you've got your New York, right? You've got your Caesar's Palace. You've got your Treasure Island, right? And all of these, you're nodding, right? Even just giving the name, even if you haven't been there, you've got an idea of what's going on.
Immediately evokes a visual, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And so too with Excalibur, right? You've got the name, but even if the name isn't, connecting to the Arthurian legend specifically for you, right? You've got this enormous white building with turrets and a moat, which is now empty. Apparently, there used to be a mechanical dragon in it, and I'm very sad it's not there anymore. The moat is empty, but, you go under a portcullis and you go into this entryway, right? It's got wood beams, stained glass. There's knights and ladies. You go downstairs and there is a show with men on horses.
It's jousting, isn't it?
It is jousting, yes. Although differently from like medieval times I've been to, there were a lot more dancing girls.
Well, it is Vegas, so.
The squires were shirtless in a way that didn't feel sort of like narratively necessary. But we left and my partner pointed out that the other thing that performs in that space, or next door maybe, but in the Excalibur Casino is a Chippendales review, The Thunder from Down Under.
Okay.
So, maybe there's a bit of double casting going on. Anyway, point being, there was a very limited number of themes that you could really make work in a Vegas casino. And one of those is the Middle Ages, right?
Yeah. And immediately recognizable, not just to, us in the United States, but internationally, like as you were saying, right? Like I think there's something about that whole, like back to the Legos, back to the crenellations, you make a thing look like a castle. Everybody's like, yep, I know exactly what's going on here.
Yep. And also I think for those of us in North America, we don't regularly encounter the kind of reality testing that might occur if, say, you were living in France near an actual 12th century castle or, hiking near the ruins of a monastery in the Lake District or so on, right? It can become pure fantasy so that things get reworked and worked, and we have this, not even a narrative, but a kind of a visual, a sonic vocabulary. The Middle Ages have very good branding in the States.
Is there something about, I'm thinking about kind of the location specificness of this, right? Is that we don't have in the United States the same access to the European Middle Ages, obviously, because of where we are. I mean, leaving aside kind of those weird things where the barons of the 1920s kind of transported medieval stuff over here.
So those of us who are not like J.P. Morgan.
That's right. So no one here is J.P. Morgan. Alas. Well, actually, I don't regret that at all.
No, I think it's fine.
But anyway, do you think that makes us kind of particularly susceptible to susceptible is not the right word, but kind of hooked on this kind of medievalism is because it seems both kind of accessible but distant in that way?
Yeah. And I think, for a place in which the European settler white version of the past has kind of been the dominant historical narrative in sort of public life and the education system, right? So as a place, we're very attached to looking to Europe for stories about the past.
Absolutely. We have a sense, right, that it's American past, like that European past is an American past. Like we don't want to admit that Native American, well, most Americans don't want to admit that Native Americans are part of that past in some way.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's an attachment to that as a narrative. Mm-hmm. But once you get into certainly the 20th century, most people's first encounter with the Middle Ages is coming through popular culture.
Sure.
It's not a situation, or even if it's not their first, the most impactful, if you talk to somebody who identifies as caring about the Middle Ages, it's unlikely to be, I had a really great 6th grade teacher who, we did Castle Week or whatever. That can happen.
Sure.
But equally or more important is I saw the Lord of the Rings movies with my dad when I was 10. Mm-hmm. I went to a Renaissance fair.
I played a video game.
I played a video game. I really love Led Zeppelin. Umberto Eco, who we mentioned as the author of The Name of the Rose, one of the all-time great historical novels, a little while ago has a wonderful essay called Dreaming the Middle Ages. And he talks about 10 little Middle Ages there. So different ways that we look back towards the Middle Ages, whether it's as a site of arcane knowledge, right? I'm perhaps dating myself and also revealing myself in other ways when I say I spent a fair amount of time in Spencer's Gifts at a certain age, right? And somebody's got to buy those like resin dragon incense holders, right? There's just a kind of saturation and permeation that becomes, after a while, recursive, right? So Ali Elvis, who is a librarian at Winterthur, associated with the University of Delaware, has this great concept of pop bibliography. And they are really interested in the representation of old, rare, arcane books in popular media, right? Including video games. And they did some research into particular books that show up in the card art for Magic the Gathering, right?
Oh, okay. Sure. Yeah.
And they actually went and talked to the artist who drew this. And in many cases, these were younger artists. I think a lot of them were from South America. And so Ali asked them, where do you get your ideas of what this magical tome needs to look like? And they said, oh, well, I just Google it. Right. And so I haven't done a Google image search for magical medieval manuscript in a second, but Google, the way that we, do research, the way that we gather references is so capacious that the proper, quote unquote, properly historical gets mixed in with the imaginative pretty quickly. And that makes it available for the kinds of aesthetic or vibey applications of the medieval that I'm interested in by talking about dirtbag medievalism.
I don't know what answer I was expecting when you said, like, how do they get their ideas? But just Google it. I mean, that makes perfect sense, right? And then going back to something you mentioned earlier, right, about how these references become recursive is that they just kind of mix into one another very quickly, where it's not necessarily... They may look like a medieval manuscript, for example, but it could be filtered through any number of other kind of fantastic or a video game reference to, images of that type of object or something like that. So I am curious, and this is something I've been wrestling with myself. So I'm going to ask you, since it's my podcast, and I'm going to do that. Is there something it just seems like there's something different about the way that Americans think about the Middle Ages? And I'm thinking about other historical periods, the way that, and just talking in very broad strokes, right? Like the way that we think about the American Civil War or ancient Rome, we tend to think about kind of, well, this is what kind of happened. And we don't seem as concerned about that when we talk about the Middle Ages, because it is more aesthetics and it is a little bit more vibes, kind of, as you were saying. Does that seem fair, or am I kind of off base here?
Yeah. So in my answer, I'm going to take us back to Petrarch, who, way back in the 14th century, he's where we kind of get our idea of a dark age versus, the title of yours and David Perry's books, Bright Ages, is riffing on, right? And, for Petrarch, he is really nostalgic for the Roman past. He's not thrilled about what's been going on in Europe over the last few centuries, right? But he's optimistic about what's going to happen in the future, right? So it's from Petrarch that the kind of idea of the Middle Ages emerges in conversation and dialogue over the following centuries, right? So the Middle Ages is always this relative term, right? It's a label that is what is not now and what is not the part of the past that we see as being contiguous with us, right?
It's an interruption.
It's an interruption. It's other than the present, right?
Yep.
And the medieval is what comes before modernity, whatever modernity is, right? So there's a kind of inherent flexibility to this idea of the medieval. It's big enough to hold whatever we need it to hold. But if we think, again, within an American context, there's always been a sense of a certain kind of small r Republican continuity with the values of Rome. You know, we see a kind of self-conscious neoclassicism even in, you know, kind of the earliest American civic architecture, right? So there's this self-consciousness about the look back to the classical past. And then, you know, you can think about the controversies over Confederate statues in the past couple of years, right? That past is not past, right?
Nope. I'm thinking of the classical columns that used to be on the east wing of the White House, for example.
For example, yes.
Yeah. Just pulling something randomly out of the air.
Just pulling something out of the air, yes. So the medieval gets to be this space of otherness that is both geographically and temporally other from where we are here and now, right? Which is why teenagers love heavy metal bands with self-consciously medievalizing typography and imagery, but it can work in a couple of different ways, right? So we can get moments of high camp medievalism, like Chapel Rowan in her various suits of armor or chainmail gowns or princess outfits. And then we can also get scumbag medievalism. So, you know, you can think about the way that this is back in 2016, right? I think 2016, when the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally happened. 2017. Thank you. And the amount of, again, self-conscious medievalizing that went on there.
Yeah.
So it can take two very different directions, but both are equipped by this sense of the medieval being something other than the here and now.
Yeah. And recognizable to one another, right?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That's in some ways kind of the weird thing, is that there is something that they're not the same thing, they're not doing the same thing, but they are kind of within the same genre.
They're within the same genre, and they're recognizing the same affordances of medievalism in American life, right? Which is that it has this malleability coupled with a fairly recognizable set of signifiers that can be used for playful purposes, for political purposes. You know, I mentioned the Unite the Right rally, but there's also a woman in the UK. Her handle is Pride Night Freya, I think.
Okay.
And she shows up at Pride events, but also medieval events. She's a trans woman dressed as a paladin with a shield that says, trans knights are human knights, right? So a riff on trans rights are human rights. So,
yeah.
And I just think that's a really smart and brilliant inhabiting of a figure, right? The medieval knight that is more often than not sort of looked to from a conservative perspective, and kind of reworking and re-inhabiting that figure in a way that really lands for me.
Yeah, and I think the medieval seems to be almost infinitely malleable in that way. Or, you know, it can be used in different ways, maybe because it seems so distant or so, you know, disparate, right?
It seems distant. And also, I think there is this sense, which is partly accurate, partly born out of the history curriculum and partly from, you know, the History Channel or whatever. But the Middle Ages is dark in the sense of there are a lot of things that we don't know.
We just don't know. Yeah.
And, you know, as a professional medievalist, there are quite a few things that we don't know. There are also quite a few things that we know.
Yeah.
But I think the mysterious elements get more play in popular culture, perhaps.
No, I think that's absolutely right, is that it's a playful space, and it can be, you know, a positive term in a way that, you know, like kind of ludic and just kind of joyful, but it can also be a playful space for some really horrible things as well. Yeah. And so that's something that I think we as medievalists have really started in a good way to come to terms with and to understand that when we talk about the Middle Ages, even just in our classrooms, is like we need to understand like there's different reasons that bring people to this topic of study, and we need to be aware of why they're here.
Yeah.
Like, and in any way, like not to speak truth about the past, but just to be kind of aware of thinking about like what it can be used for harmful ways in some of the darker places or something like that. So
yeah.
Well, we are unfortunately running out of time. This has been a really lovely conversation, and I'm so glad that we finally got to modernity. It seems like now that we're at modernity, we can leave off. For our listeners, if they do want to learn more about you or your work, Megan, like how can they find you?
Probably the easiest way to find out about me and my work and, whatever I had for lunch today is Blue Sky. I'm very findable there. I'm still working on we mentioned at the top that I'm currently co-chair of my department, which is slowing down many things. So there is no Dirtbag Medievalism book yet, although one is coming. But if folks want to find the original piece, it's short. If you've made it this far through the episode, you'll probably love it. That's on avidly.com. So findable there.
If you subscribe to the Patreon, that will be sent to your inbox, I will say. And your handle on Blue Sky is at Megan L. Cook, if I am remembering correctly. Does that sound right?
That is correct. MEGANLCOOK.
Yes, we need to specify the spelling of Megan. So yes, that
and
would
Cook,
be that would be useful. Yes, it would be useful if I actually understood how audio worked in this podcast, but we'll get there eventually sometime in maybe year 3 or something like that. I don't know.
There's time for that.
Anyway, thank you so much, Megan, for joining us.
Welcome.
This has
been great.
A delight, and please go out there and look up Megan and find her stuff on Dirtbag Medievalism and read all her other stuff about book history. Think about how you consume text or engage with text the next time that you do so.
And, if folks are out there and there is something in their own life or media diet and they say, oh my God, this is Dirtbag Medievalism, I want to know about it, let me know, hit me up. I am always collecting examples of this infinitely rich trove of cultural artifacts.
It's kind of lovely to be a person that has a thing, and like I love getting tagged like on any social media, like, oh, you would love this. And I was like, yes, I do. Thank you so much for sharing this.
I do.
So,
yes,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So
no, there is a genuine appreciation for this kind of lowbrow medievalism that I have in fact constructed a fairly elaborate research agenda in order to go to more Renaissance fairs and
fantastic
buy more tarot card decks, that kind of thing.
Okay, well, we're going to have you back on at some point to talk about Ren fairs because I have lots of
maybe
thoughts.
Once I finish the book.
There you go. There, absolutely. Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you again, Megan, for joining us. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next week for another episode of American Medieval. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiaffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.